Hello, you are listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio, your global feel-good radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer and Amazon #1 best-selling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Now, our guest today is Clarice Belcher. Clarice Belcher is a teacher of nonviolent communication and a workshop leader for nonviolent communication here in the Atlanta area. You can find out more about nonviolent communication, the Center for Nonviolent Communication's website, which is cnvc.org. Welcome, Clarice Belcher.
Thank you, Catherine. I appreciate this.
Now, Clarice Belcher, what exactly is nonviolent communication? I mean, you and I are talking right now, and I'm not slapping you, I'm not punching you. What is nonviolent communication?
Well, it's interesting you should say that because people tend to think of violence as slapping or hitting or cursing, and it certainly is that, but can also be more subtle. It can be a kind of silence that's really about withholding. It can be a rolling of the eyes. So violence has a number of characteristics. But nonviolence, as Marshall Rosenberg envisioned it, really comes from Gandhi's definition of nonviolence, which is our natural state of compassion when violence has subsided from the heart. So Marshall believed, as did Gandhi, that we are all essentially and basically compassionate beings.
And so what exactly then is nonviolent communication?
So nonviolent communication is a way of speaking that keeps us connected to the best in ourselves. Marshall was very interested in discovering what is it that keeps people connected to the best of themselves in difficult situations, and what is it that helps them to get disconnected. In fact, in his book, Nonviolent Communication, he talked about that on the very first page, in the very first chapter, in the very first paragraph. And for Marshall, his answer was language, that it is language that helps us keep ourselves connected. The way I think, the way I speak to myself and to another will determine if I'm going to come across violently or not violently.
Now, my understanding, this method that we're talking about, nonviolent communication, has been used in, say, the Middle East peace process, but it's also a means of learning how to communicate that can help me maybe talk to my teenagers or talk to my spouse or resolve disputes with my neighbors, right?
Yes, that's a very astute observation. This kind of communication can be used in any setting. In fact, Marshall was a mediator, and he did go to the Middle East. That was one of many places that he went in the world to bring this information. Interestingly, and I'm very excited to share this, that the CEO of Microsoft decided to bring this in. So it's being used in businesses as well. So it's not just one application. To the extent that we are all people, we are all human beings, we all then have this capacity for compassion. It doesn't matter where or how it is. We can have access to it in any time we want, no matter where we are.
Now, who exactly was Marshall Rosenberg? Because I understand he has passed away.
Yes, I am sad to say that he did pass February the 5th, was it the 15th? February 2015, that much for sure. He was a psychologist, and as a young boy, his parents moved his family to Detroit, Michigan, and it was during the time of the riots, and they literally locked themselves inside their home. They were terrified at what was going on outside the front door, and when it all was over and they opened that door, there were 40 people who had been killed during those riots. So as a young boy, he had a very early initiation, if you will, into violence. I imagine, this is a story I make up, that that was probably something that motivated him to become interested in violence and nonviolence and how do we manage this. As a psychologist, he was studied with Carl Rogers, and that, in fact, Carl Rogers was Marshall's mentor. And it was with Carl Rogers that Marshall began to bring together some of the pieces that would become what he calls nonviolent communication. One of those was feelings, and another was empathy.
And exactly who was Carl Rogers?
Carl Rogers was one of the preeminent psychologists of the 20th century, a man very well respected for his contribution to the field of psychology. So Marshall was really very fortunate to have had the opportunity to have studied with him.
And Marshall Rosenberg was the author of the book that we're talking about today, which is Nonviolent Communication. So if you really take a liking to what Clarice Belcher and I are talking about today, you can get the book Nonviolent Communication, and it's got some very clear steps. So again, we're talking about nonviolent communication. So if we're listening to people talk, what's the difference between nonviolent communication and, say, regular communication?
Well, that's an interesting question. The way Marshall saw it, many of us have been educated or trained or enculturated to speak life-alienating dialogue or life-alienating language. And that would sound like you're an idiot and a moron, or you never show up for time, what is your problem? Or you never help around the house. So these are examples of what Marshall would call life-alienating dialogue, mainly because these words lead to hurt and pain. If I were to say to you, you're the worst I've ever seen, that's going to make it really hard for you to hear what is alive in me.
Right.
And so it alienates you, and to an extent is going to alienate me from you. And it's also going to alienate me from the best in me. So life alienating language does not serve to help us stay connected to our compassion. In fact, it serves to separate it from us. And we have a lot of examples, even in these days and times, of people who use this kind of language and speak this kind of language without maybe fully comprehending that they are disconnecting themselves from the best in themselves.
Right. And, you know, here we are at the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. So we're wanting to learn about many methods that we can heal ourselves. And part of this nonviolent communication, as I understand it, is a way of healing our relationships with other people.
And it's also a way of healing our relationships with ourselves as well. It's not just the words I say to you that are life alienating. It can be the words I say to myself. For example, why can't I ever get anything right? I don't ever seem to be able to do anything well. What is my problem? So that's just as life alienating as anything else.
So when we speak in a way that's disconnected, and by disconnected, I assume you mean disconnected from our higher self, disconnected from our heart, disconnected from our soul?
Or from our compassion. That would be one way of looking at it. Often nonviolent communication is nicknamed language of compassion, because it is that, because it is a way of helping us stay connected to our compassion in ourselves and in others.
Right. And for our audience, how would you define compassion? I could come up with the definition as a medical intuitive, but how would you define it?
So the way I understand Marshall defining it, compassion is a natural flow that exists between one and another. I give because I want to give. I give because it is a joy to give. I do not give because I think I ought to, or I should, or I have to. That milieu is not compassion. Compassion is, I have this in me to give, I want to give, it brings me joy to give, and so I give.
So, from my perspective as a medical intuitive healer, I would define compassion as a quality, a positive quality emanating from our heart.
I think that's fair enough, absolutely.
You know, and we can feel when it's present, whether we're speaking words of compassion or the language of compassion, or when we're even not speaking, by how we hold ourselves and how we interact with other people.
We
So
can also tell by how we feel, and that's one of the components of the language of compassion, is how we feel. Is by no means the only component. But the four components that Marshall believed in are these: observe without evaluation, share feelings, state needs, and make a specific request. So that's it. It's those four pieces. And that's one of the reasons why I love his work so much, because of its elegant simplicity. I don't have to struggle to remember 32 rules, just those four. And in fact, if I get into a pinch, if I find myself in the reptilian part of my brain, right at the edge of reactivity, right at the edge of wanting to say something that is life alienating, then I can at least be aware of what I'm feeling in that moment. The moment I'm aware that I feel anger or outrage, then that is the moment I have begun to connect with what is real and alive in me. And interestingly, that is also the moment when my anger will decrease a little bit in intensity. It's surprising to realize that people who might enter in a room screaming and yelling have not yet connected to their anger. Those of us who hear them screaming and yelling are clear that they're angry, but they have not yet connected to their anger. When we connect to anger, it is a quiet moment, not a loud one. So it is quite possible that there are many people who have many feelings but are very much unaware of them. So this work, part of this work, is to be aware, to be very clear what it is I'm feeling in any given moment. In this moment, for example, I'm feeling a little nervous because I've not been on a radio show before, and I'm also very excited to be able to have this opportunity that you have so graciously provided to share Marshall's extraordinary work with more people than I could possibly do at home. So those would be my feelings. And what needs to that may? Well, it meets my need to contribute to the well-being of others. And needs is another component of Marshall's. In fact, of those four components, the needs is the most pivotal. In fact, Marshall believed needs constituted 90% of our connection. That would be my connection to myself. It would be my connection to you. That's amazing, because so many of us are not clear about what a need is. So many of us have so much confusion about a need, and so many of us have been directed away from our need, either in families of origins and education, and that's really a very sad thing. In fact, I feel sad about that, because if needs are in fact 90% of my connection, and I have been directed away from my needs, then I'm being directed away from myself. So how then can I give voice to what is important or what is alive in me? Then I risk resorting to blame or shame or any milieu like that. So needs is often confused with the word needy or neediness. And that's one thing I would like to share with your audience, is that the two are not the same. A need, and this is the best definition I know, it comes from Lucy Liu, who collaborated with Marshall Rosenberg. And her definition was this: a need is that quality that sustains a life I cherish. So that's a very different way about thinking about need. And in fact, the cnbc.org website has a list of needs. And I happen to like counting, and I counted the number of needs on that list, and there are 84 needs, which is astounding. When I was growing up, when I was in fact in 7th grade science class, my teacher told me we have 3 needs: food, air, water. That's it. And what Marshall saw is that was not it, that we have so many more needs. So what does a need sound like? Well, we have a need for connection. We have a need for intimacy. We have a need for belonging. We have a need for support. We have a need to be seen, a need to be heard, a need for play, a need for physical well-being, a need for meaning. So there's so many needs. So we restrict ourselves when we don't have the vocabulary for needs.
Right. Now, here we are again at the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. So when we use nonviolent communication, what are the benefits for our own self-healing?
Say, for one thing, clarity. I love having clarity, and the precision of these needs and the precision of the feelings is very useful to me. I don't have to stay confused in this vague, ambiguous place like what's going on. That's the beauty of this work. It's an inside job. I can always know at any given time what I'm feeling and what I'm needing. And just as there's a lot of confusion around the word needs, there's also a lot of confusion around the word feelings. Most people will say something, for example, I feel that was unfair. And they said the words, I feel, but what followed those words is not a feeling, it's a judgment. Now, with that said, if I hold the judgment that something was unfair, I might very well have strong feelings about that. I might very well feel angry. I might feel outraged. I may feel disappointed. I might feel frustrated. Those are names of feelings. Not all of them. There are a number. In fact, the same website, www.cnvc.org, that offers a list of needs also offers a list of feelings. And it's 2 pages long because there are 2 sets of feelings. One of those feelings is what I feel when my needs are met or satisfied. And another set are the feelings I feel when my needs are not met or not satisfied. So not surprisingly, if I feel happy, if I feel joyous, here's one you don't hear often, if I feel rapturous, then my needs are met. And I can know that in that moment, my needs are in fact met by the way I feel. Similarly, if I feel upset, if I feel anxious, if I feel apprehensive, then I can know I have an unmet need. And rather than stay in that feeling in confusion, I can get curious instead. So what is that unmet need? And figure that out. Do I feel apprehension because my need for support isn't being met? Do I feel nervous because my need for belonging isn't met? You see, once I get those pieces of information, then I can begin to make very clear decisions about how I want to get those needs met. That's the 4th piece of Marshall's work. I tend to think of it as strategies. He called it making specific requests. But many of us have been trained and educated and enculturated to think first in terms of strategies, without taking into consideration our needs and our feelings. If I were to say to you, for example, I need you to go to the store, I have not, in fact, stated a need. What I have done is state a strategy.
Right.
The problem with this is that when I talk the language of strategies, I am not connected to my feelings or needs, and I risk deciding there's only this one strategy that will work. So what if you don't want to go to the store? What if, for example, you're feeling tired and you have a need for rest? Well, then if I ask you to go to the store and you say no, then that risks my being angry at you. Like, why not? What is your problem? Why don't you try to help out? But when I understand that you're coming from feelings and needs just as I am, then together we can explore the strategies, because the strategies arise organically from the acknowledged feelings and needs. So it may be neither one of us goes to the store, maybe neither one of us cooks because both of us are tired. So maybe we decide, let's order pizza
Okay.
and have it brought in.
So going back to my question, which was, what are the benefits to you of using nonviolent communication? So based on what you've just said, Clarice Belcher, it sounds like, first of all, when we communicate in this nonviolent communication manner, we have clarity, so we understand what we're feeling and what we need, but also it gives us a system of effectively getting our needs met, right?
Yes, because the moment I'm clear what my need is, the moment I'm naming a specific need, then the strategy will become clear. And it's amazing because sometimes I might think it's need X, but if I sit and take a look at the list of needs, I might discover it's something else. And the same thing is true for feelings too. I might feel, for example, angry, but then when I sit with that anger and discover the need with it, I also feel very sad.
Okay, so when we use this nonviolent communication, we have clarity about what we are feeling and what we need. We have a method of getting our needs met, and then when we can get our needs met, then we're going to just simply be happier. Because
Well,
if your needs are not met, you can't be happy, right?
and if you don't know what the needs are and you keep pushing the strategy and it never works, then that's painful for an individual. It creates anguish. But the other thing, too, beyond clarity, which I think is very important, is connection. Because when I connect with you, with my feelings and my needs, and you connect with me with your feelings and my needs, then what happens is two things, really. One, we're showing up whole. It's not just from my head. Strategies is always about from my head. But with feelings, it's from my heart. So I'm showing up whole. I'm bringing in my full self, both mind and heart, just as you are too. And often in the process, that will be a very vulnerable experience. Both of us are showing up with what's real and alive in the moment, rather than trying to hide it with a sort of nice, polite demeanor. In fact, we don't hide it at all. This work isn't about hiding. It's about telling our truths in ways that do not wound others.
So what are the benefits? So we talked about the benefits to ourselves individually. What are the benefits for actually healing relationships? How can nonviolent communication help to heal our relationship with people that we care about?
So here's an example I will use. This has to do with Mason's sister and her two young sons who came to visit one day. They were very young then. And Mason
Mason is your partner,
yes,
correct? Okay.
yes, that's correct. And he found them in the hallway, shall we say, not entirely calm or peaceful, about to kill themselves. So he decided to bring them to the kitchen table, because this is where Mason and I have our own discussions, so we could talk about what was alive in them. And so we did. We asked them, so what are you feeling? And one of Mason's nephews said, well, I feel jealous because his older brother was the eldest and got more toys. And I have to tell you, you could hear a pin drop. It was so quiet. This child showing up so vulnerably in that way from his heart. And his mother, who is a wonderful mother, heard that. And I think she began to change some of the ways in which she mothered him. She may very well have spent more time with him. I don't know, it's a story I'm making up, but what I do know is when I saw them the next time, both boys were calmer than they had been. So when someone comes up from a vulnerable place like that, how can your heart not be moved?
Right. So my understanding of nonviolent communication, the benefit for healing relationships, again, is that it gives you a method, if you will, of speaking your truth, speaking about what you feel, what you need, and getting your needs met so that the other person can understand you and also meet those needs, right?
Yes, yes. And there are far more strategies than there are needs. So many people get a little too concerned, I think, about the strategies. Quick, quick, what are we going to do about this? Doesn't have to be a quick thing. Simply connect first with feelings and needs, and then see the strategies that arise from that connection. Mace and I have used this in our own relationship. It surprises people to know I have a temper. And I have a very quick, hot temper. Mason, of course, is sworn to secrecy, not ever to tell, but he is a witness to that. And over the years, as I have used this, I have been able to connect much more quickly to my anger when it comes, and to be able to speak to him in ways that do convey how I feel. In fact, very recently, I found myself very angry at Mason. But what I did that was differently was, rather than attack him or make him wrong or blame him, I expressed my anger. And I did express that anger in an angry tone of voice. I said, I am so angry at you. But that's useful information for me and for Mason, because both of us can know there's an unmet need here. And similarly for Mason, if he is angry, then we both can know there's an unmet need. So rather than stew and steam in the juices of anger, we can get curious instead. So what is the unmet need? Because when I begin to name the unmet need, I can feel the intensity of my energies lessening.
Right. So it sounds like with nonviolent communication, it's basically a system that allows you to create a safe space so that you can understand what's going on with the other person and also meet the needs of the people that you care about, and then everyone's happy.
Yes, that was one of the basic thrusts of Marshall's work, that the idea is we want to contribute to the well-being of all. So if there are 5 of us, so to speak, at the table, then we're interested in meeting the needs of all, not just 1 or 2 or 4, but all 5. And that's, you can do that. It might not seem possible, but to the extent that everyone begins to name needs, it becomes clearer. And what has often happened between Mason and me is we have had different strategies, but discovered we had the same need. So that's very interesting to us. So once we're clear, if we have a need for rest, then it becomes clear, well, what is the strategy? Maybe one might want to take a nap. Maybe another one wants to read or watch a show. It doesn't matter really. What matters is that we work together, exploring what our needs are and arising through that exploration the strategies that contribute to the well-being of both of us, or any group, not just a couple, but even a group. Same thing would apply in a business setting. You know, you have people sometimes on teams, and perhaps they have conflicts on those teams. Well, if they can begin to think in terms of what their feelings and needs are, then the strategy is going to rise from that. So rather than go, quick, quick, do this thing now, get curious, because it may be that one of the reasons why things aren't getting quickly done is because needs aren't being met by
Okay.
others.
Clarice Belcher, you've been teaching nonviolent communication for many years. How did you come to learn this material?
It's an interesting story. I was attending a church, actually, and that church got involved in a conflict so intense it literally polarized the congregation. And the minister and his staff did not have the skills for managing that conflict. They recognized that, and they called in outside help. And that outside help was in the form of a facilitator who offered a workshop. And I was very curious to see what he had to say. And it was in that workshop that he held up Marshall's book and he said, read it and memorize it. And I was so astounded. I had never heard a book endorsed in that way. So I thought, I think I will. So I did. I got the book and I read it. I loved it. Even though Marshall Rosenberg was a psychologist, he used very ordinary language, everyday examples. It's an easy to read book. And when I finished it, I thought I would love to meet him. And surely enough, 2 years later, he came to Atlanta and he gave a 5-day workshop. I attended 2 or maybe 3 of those 5 days. And then he came again and offered a 10-day intensive, and I attended all 10 days of the intensive. So that's how I came to know about Marshall's work, and am so grateful that he did come into my life. I had understood about feelings at the time I met Marshall, came to know him, but the piece that really excited me was the piece around needs. It was never enough for me to be able to name my feelings, because I think feelings are connected to something more, but I never knew what that something more was until he used the word need. And the moment he began to show the connection between a feeling and a need, that I feel apprehension because I have an unmet need, or I feel joy because I have a met need, it was like, yes. I was so on board with everything he said. There were others in the audience who would go, yes, but I was not one of those. I was like, yes, this man is spot on.
So years ago, I can remember reading the book Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. And as a medical intuitive healer, I've recommended that book to clients for years, but I never had the privilege of studying with him. Now, Clarice Belcher, let's break this down for our audience. There are 4 steps in language of compassion. Could you slowly and clearly go over each step what the step is and how to do it.
Okay, so the 4 steps provides not just a structure, but also a process. So in this order, the first step is observe without evaluation. So many of us tend to observe with evaluation. You're an idiot or a moron, for example. So the observation would be more along the lines of what was it that that person said or didn't say, or what that person did and didn't do that helps me draw the conclusion he's an idiot and a moron. Because obviously the idiot moron piece is the evaluation.
So that would be like, I notice ... or I observe ...
I observe it's what I see, it's what I hear. Those are part of the observations. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the first step is you would say what you're observing, what I see, what I hear, what I observe. Okay.
And you try to do that in context of behavior and time. So what was the behavior then that creates this idea in my mind that this person is an idiot and a moron? So perhaps in my history with someone, this person consistently shows up late, and I'm angry about that. And so I don't tell the person the context for my anger. I simply say, you're an idiot and a moron. But if we want to use this as an example, then I might say, when I observe that this is the 5th time in 2 weeks you have arrived 30 minutes late, do you see, that's not a judgment. That is an observation without evaluation. And so that gives the individual a context. We're talking here about the time at which you arrive. It's not about getting the groceries or we've got to get the car repaired. So that was how I would begin a conversation, is with an observation without evaluation.
And then the second step, give us the second step.
The second step is what I feel, share my feelings. So in this case, if my observation is that this individual has come 30 minutes late 5 times in 2 weeks, I might feel frustrated, or I might feel angry, or I might feel sad. And so let's say I feel frustrated. So I would share, I feel frustrated. And I would say it just like that. So to share feelings requires no more than 3 words. The first 2, I feel, and then the third, actually naming the feeling. So if we were to continue, when I observe that you have arrived 30 minutes late 5 times in the past 2 weeks, I feel frustrated. Those would be those 2 pieces. Then the third piece would be stating my need. So what might my need be? Well, perhaps it might be a number of needs. I have a need for support. I have a need to know I matter. That might be one that would be real for me. And so I would share with him, I have a need to know that I matter. And that's the third of it. So the fourth piece would be the strategy. And this is interesting. I can go in a lot of different directions on this strategy. But if I'm having this very vulnerable conversation with him, where I'm sharing my observations and my feelings of frustration and my need to know I matter, I might want to be sure that he heard me in the way I want him to hear me. So I would make a request, and Marshall suggested preface it with the 5 magic words. Would you be willing to? So I might say, would you be willing to tell me what you heard me say? And let's say he says, well, you think I'm an idiot and a moron. Then I might say, well, this is what I want you to hear. That when you arrive 5 times in 2 weeks, 30 minutes late, I feel frustrated because I have a need to know I matter. And he doesn't have to necessarily repeat all of that. It would be useful if he were to say, so when I'm late, you think you don't matter. And then that might be enough information for me to think, yes, I've been heard now.
Right. And my understanding is those phrase, would you be willing to, is so important in our interpersonal communication because it gets a buy-in. It's not like saying, you better do this or else. It's not a command. It's actually a graceful request so that the other person understands that they can bless us by, listening And, again, by buying in, they're participating in the process.
And it is the idea of, would you be willing to? And that's the piece that softens it. That's the piece that helps a person hear it's not a demand. Now, with that said, I have to say this, the litmus test for whether or not it was a demand is whether or not I'm angry. If he says, no, I'm not willing, then I can know that I intended that as a demand. So that's interesting information.
Right. So the 4 steps, again, for our audience is I observe, ... I feel, ... I need, ... and then would you be willing to, right? ...
Yes.
And
And for some people that feels a little bit uncomfortable because it's a whole new way of expressing what's alive in them. But if we continue to express how we feel in a given moment without that precision, without that clarity, then we really run the risk of not being heard in the way we want to be heard, of risk of not being connected to people we want to be connected with. Now, with that said, in my practice groups, I tend to do what I think classic nonviolent communication. And I hold people's feet to the fire because I want them to know this is a safe place. It's okay to say I feel X, whatever it is, or it's I need X, whatever that is. It's okay to say those words. But if someone is like, that feels a little stilted for me, whatever you want to say outside the practice group is fine. But to the extent that you're willing to share your feeling and to share a need, that's what really matters. So there's a street version. And the street version might be, instead of I have a need or I need, it might be I want X. I'm a little nervous with that because sometimes I think wants are really more about strategies. But the bottom line is the person speaking them, are they clear that they just used a word that indicates a need?
Right. And as in my work as a medical intuitive healer, I talk about the difference between needs and wants. I need to get enough rest. I may want to go to Paris, but if I don't end up going, it's not going to be the end of the world. But if I don't get enough rest, that's a problem. And a need, you'll feel out of balance and off balance and unhappy if you don't get your needs met. And I think, to me, this is so powerful because so much of our happiness depends on how well we can communicate with other people. And so much depression and anxiety stems from not getting our needs met and not knowing how to communicate well in our interpersonal relationships.
I appreciate your bringing that in. There's something else in our country, as you well know, we have a big issue with loneliness. And how ironic is that? We have more technology for being able to communicate, and yet many people feel very lonely. And I think often they feel lonely because they aren't sharing what is alive in them in terms of their feelings and needs. They aren't heard at that level. Often, if you ask even someone intimately, that is to say someone you know, how are you feeling? They may go, oh, I feel fine. I feel good. And so you get information from that. You have a sense that there's something positive here, but in no way is that precise enough to be able to step into their experience. I had someone in one of my practice groups decide to say, I'm going to say I feel rapturous. And when was the last time you heard someone say, I feel rapturous, or I feel enlivened, or I feel exhilarated? It's usually, I feel good. So the experience is different when someone gives a precise name for a feeling, a precise name for a need. I can be present, I can be connected in a way I can't be otherwise. And I think it also really, that level of intimacy eases whatever loneliness was there. In fact, as you know, I don't have a cell phone. I may very well be one of 10 people in the country who don't. And one of the reasons why I don't, I was in a parking lot one day when a car pulled up and the driver gets out of her car looking at her cell phone, and the passenger gets out of her side of the car looking at her cell phone. And I'm like, Why are you together? You're not even talking to one another. And yet, even when we are together talking to one another, how much of it is deep? How much of it is intimate? Or is it, well, did you pick up the groceries? Yeah, they didn't have any bananas today. Oh, that's too bad. We'll have to go get them later. You can have just so many of those conversations. And then if that's all you have, I can only imagine the anguish of the loneliness of that.
Right. Now, Clarice Belcher, longtime workshop leader and teacher of nonviolent communication, what exactly is a need? I think this is so important that we talk about this because many of us are disconnected from what we actually need, what your body needs, what our soul needs, what our inner child needs. So can you give us examples of some needs?
Yes, so there, as I said, there are 85 different needs. I won't read all 84 of them or 85 of them to you. Some of them are needs grouped around social needs. Some of them are grouped around physical needs. Some of them are grouped around spiritual needs. So a social need might be intimacy or connection or community or belonging, or the need to be seen, to be appreciated, to be accepted. So those are some examples of social needs. Physical need, I have a need for physical well-being. I have a need for rest. I have a need for food. Those would be some of the physical needs. Spiritual needs, I have a need for meaning. I have a need for contributing to the well-being of all. I have a need for autonomy. I have a need for freedom. So some of those would be spiritual needs. It's interesting because I might say, for example, I need you to get your homework done on time. Well, that's not really stating a need, that's stating a strategy. But it may be, I have a need to support you in your education. Would you be willing to do your homework now? So that's how you might express that. And then the child, if he says, no, I don't want to do my homework, this is the beauty of this communication system. The child who says no to the parent who's saying, do your homework now, is saying yes to something else. So rather than think, oh, God, this child is miserable. He never pays attention to me. He's horrible. I don't know what has gotten into him. To hold instead the idea that he has a need he's trying to meet. And maybe, I don't know, we'll make up the story. He's not doing his homework in this moment because he feels tired and has the need for rest. So if that's the case, then maybe the homework doesn't have to be done now. Maybe it can be done 30 minutes from now when the child has had a chance to rest. You see, then you're using power with, not power over. So the parent and child work through this together. And the same thing is true in terms of relationships between men and women. It's power with, not power over. And the same can in fact be used in businesses. Not power with, not power over, but power with, so that people are contributing and have a sense and experience of contributing to the well-being of others without making someone wrong.
Right. And, I think you're bringing up something really important, Clarice Belcher, which is just giving other people the benefit of the doubt that they're trying to get their own needs met. And sometimes we don't understand what those needs are. Maybe they don't either, but if you just use this method of communication, you can begin to understand the other person's needs, and so that everyone can get their needs met.
And not just this communication, but the beautiful thing of it is we have a list of needs. So I don't have to guess what a need is. We have printed lists in our home. In fact, we keep our needs and feelings list on the refrigerator, held on the refrigerator by magnets, because we tend to have our conversations in the kitchen. So if we're struggling with what a need is, with what my specific need is, or with what Mason's specific need may be, we don't have to guess. We don't have to look through a dictionary and spend hours. It's right there on the list. And this very precise language makes it so much easier to be able to access what the need is, which is interesting because ease is in and of itself a need. I have a need for ease. So having a list handily available certainly meets my need for ease.
So much of this is about strategy. Again, the 4 steps: I observe, I feel, I need, would you be willing to? But it's also a mindset. So the language of compassion is also a mindset. So final question, Clarice Belcher, what kind of mindset can we adopt so that when we do communicate with other people, we can stay in our compassion and our empathy so that they know we feel that we care about them and that we're wanting to have this peaceful but effective communication?
So empathy is a very interesting idea in Marshall's work, and I appreciate your bringing that up. Empathy is holding a safe presence for someone to explore what is alive in them. So if you have a child who is distraught or upset and screaming and yelling, you wouldn't tell them, don't do that. You would hold a safe, quiet presence where what you do is listen. You don't say anything, you don't judge him, you let him give full vent to whatever it is that is alive in him in the moment, recognizing that he is not yet connected to his feelings and needs. So if you do decide to say words in empathy, you would do so in the form of questions, and you would do so, are you feeling X? Do you have a need for Y?
You've been listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer and Amazon #1 bestselling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Our guest today has been Clarice Belcher, teacher and workshop leader of nonviolent communication. You can learn even more about nonviolent communication by visiting the Center for Nonviolent Communication at cnvc.org and also reading the life-changing book, Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. And remember, when you take the time to speak the language of compassion, you heal yourself and you also heal your relationships with everyone around you. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.